Behold the pinnacle of society, a duke perhaps, or a wealthy courtier at the Palace of Versailles. His clothes are worth a fortune, his jewels are dazzling, his wig is a masterpiece of powdered engineering. He carries himself with an air of effortless superiority, a man who is clearly the master of his world. There is just one thing you need to know about him, one small, fragrant secret hiding beneath all that silk and perfume. He hasn't had a proper bath in months, possibly years. And he wasn't alone. His own king, the great son, King Louis XIV, the man who built the most glamorous palace in the world, was said to have taken only 3 full-body baths in his entire adult life. This wasn't a personal quirk. For nearly 300 years, the elite of Europe, the kings, queens, and nobles, who set the standards for fashion and culture, collectively decided that being clean was dangerous. They came to believe with the certainty of scientific fact that water was the enemy, and that a thick layer of grime sweat and expensive perfume was a sign not of poor hygiene, but of high status. This raises some profound and deeply unsettling questions. Why did an entire continent, which had inherited the grand bathing traditions of the Roman Empire, suddenly declare a war on soap? What scientific truth could possibly have convinced them that filth was a shield and a hot bath was an open invitation to death? And if they weren't bathing, what exactly were they doing about the inescapable realities of greasy hair, rotting teeth, and the ever-present, ever-ripening scent of the human body? The answers are a bizarre and fascinating journey into a world of bad science, high fashion, and some truly breathtaking smells. Welcome to Cursed Chambers, where for centuries the height of sophistication was smelling like a flower garden that had been planted on top of a landfill, and you thought your roommate was bad. So how did this happen? How did an entire continent of otherwise intelligent, sophisticated people collectively decide to break up with bathing? To understand this truly bizarre chapter in the history of hygiene, we have to perform a bit of mental time travel. We have to delete a crucial piece of software from our modern brains, the knowledge of germs. Forget bacteria, forget viruses, forget everything you know about microbiology. None of it exists. Welcome to a world where disease is not a microscopic invader, but a mysterious, malevolent force that drifts through the world like a phantom. A world where the greatest scientific minds believed that the most dangerous thing you could do was open a window at the wrong time of day, or simply take a deep breath in the wrong part of town. To understand the Age of Grime, you have to first understand the terrifying, all-powerful villain of our story. And its name was Miasma. The Miasma theory was the central unifying and catastrophically wrong idea that governed health and sickness for centuries. The word itself comes from the ancient Greek for pollution, and the concept was simple: disease was caused by bad air. They believed that rotting organic matter, garbage, sewage, swamp water, even the soil after a battle released invisible noxious clouds of pestilence. Think of it like this: they believed the world had invisible bad Wi-Fi spots for disease, and these toxic clouds could drift down a street, get trapped in a valley, or seep into your home, and if you were unlucky enough to inhale this corrupted air, you would get sick. For them, a bad smell wasn't just unpleasant, it was a physical threat. A foul odor was the sensory evidence of a miasma. This meant that a city with its open sewers and mountains of refuse wasn't just smelly, it was a death trap. This wasn't just superstition, it was the consensus of the top medical and scientific minds of the day. And this theory had a terrifying corollary when it came to personal hygiene. If disease is a vapor that floats in the air, how does it get into your body? Their answer: through the pores of your skin. They envisioned the skin not as a protective barrier, but as a porous, vulnerable membrane full of tiny doorways. And what was the best way to throw all those doorways wide open? A nice hot bath. In their minds, sitting in a tub of warm water was the equivalent of disabling your computer's firewall, turning off your antivirus, and then clicking on every suspicious email attachment you could find. They believed a bath would leave you soft, vulnerable, and completely exposed to any passing miasma that happened to be drifting by. Water wasn't a cleanser, it was a security risk. Now you might be asking, why would they believe something so counterintuitive? The answer lies in trauma. A deep, continent-wide, generational trauma. The memory of the Black Death, which had wiped out as much as half of Europe's population in the 14th century, was burned into their collective psyche. It was a cataclysm so devastating that it defied all explanation. In the aftermath, people were desperate for answers, and the miasma theory, while wrong, offered a kind of comfort. It was a more scientific explanation than simply, God is angry at us. It suggested that the enemy was something tangible, bad air, and could perhaps be fought. This terror led directly to the downfall of one of society's great institutions, the public bathhouse. In the Middle Ages, bathing was actually a common and social activity. But after the plague, these warm, steamy, and crowded places came to be seen as epicenters of death chambers where thousands of people opened their pores in unison to welcome in the pestilence. Slowly but surely, the bathhouses were abandoned, and the cultural habit of bathing went with them. This created a new set of problems. If you've sworn off water, what do you do about the fact that the human body is well a bit gross? The nobility's solution was not to eliminate dirt, but to manage it, to cover it up, to fight a war of scents. This is where we see the rise of an industry that would define the era perfume. And let's be clear, we are not talking about the light floral body spray you might buy at the mall. This was heavy-duty, industrial-strength fragrance. The perfumers of Grasse and Paris became the arms dealers in this new war on body odor. Their concoctions were made from incredibly powerful animal-based ingredients. Musk, from the glands of a musk deer. Civet, a paste-like secretion from the perineal glands of the civet cat. And ambergris, a waxy, fragrant substance that is essentially a secretion from the digestive system of a sperm whale. These potent, oily substances weren't designed to be subtle. Their job was to be louder than the smell of unwashed humanity. It was less a cosmetic and more a form of olfactory armor. A nobleman or noblewoman would carry a pomander, a small metal ball, filled with these pungent resins, which they could hold to their nose whenever they encountered an unpleasant smell, which, given the state of their cities and their own bodies, was probably quite often. It was a personal portable air freshener for navigating a stinky world. The world they lived in was an assault on the senses. The average city street was, to put it bluntly, an open sewer. The air was a thick cocktail of coal smoke, cheap gin, and human desperation. The nobility tried to create a fragrant bubble to float above this stench, but they were still part of it. And in the bizarre social landscape of the royal court, which operated less like a government and more like the most brutal high school cafeteria you can imagine, these hygiene habits became a part of the performance. Having the most expensive French perfume wasn't just about smelling good, it was about showing you could afford it. Having a pristine white linen shirt to change into multiple times a day showed you had immense wealth. There was a certain snobbery to it all. While the common folk smelled of sweat and honest labor, the nobility smelled of musk spices and a faint underlying funk. In this world, the idea of purity was paramount, but their definition of purity was a universe away from our own. It was a purity of appearance, of social standing, and of avoiding the bad air, not a purity achieved with soap and water. So what we have is a perfect storm of historical circumstances. You have a terrified populace haunted by the memory of a devastating plague. You have a flawed but universally accepted scientific theory that tells them water is a gateway to death. And you have a hyper-competitive social elite obsessed with status and appearance. These were not stupid people. They were intelligent, educated individuals acting logically based on the best and most terrifyingly wrong information they had. They were trapped in a prison of their own flawed understanding, a world where being dirty was a sign of wisdom and being clean was an invitation to the grave. This was the fundamental rule of the game that would dictate the bizarre head-to-toe hygiene practices of an entire era. So if the best and brightest of European society were terrified of taking a bath, what exactly did they do? How did they navigate a world without daily showers, deodorant, and dental floss? Well, get ready, because we are about to embark on a guided tour of the aristocratic body from head to toe. It's going to be a shocking, slightly smelly, and deeply illuminating journey. Please keep your hands and feet inside the vehicle at all times. Let's start with the biggest surface area, the skin. We've established that a full-body bath was seen as a medical risk, a dangerous gamble with death. A king or queen might take one a handful of times a year, often on the strict advice of a physician who would supervise the event, as if it were a dangerous surgical procedure, carefully managing the water temperature and duration to minimize the risk of pore opening and subsequent miasma invasion. For day-to-day life, the nobility practiced a fascinating and rather fragrant form of what we can only call dry cleaning. The primary weapon in their war against grime was not soap, but fabric, specifically fine white linen. The theory was that linen was a uniquely absorbent material, not just for sweat, but for the body's ill humors and impurities. They believed a clean linen shirt acted like a magical sponge, literally pulling the dirt and toxins out of your skin. So the daily ritual for a wealthy person wasn't a shower. It was a change of clothes. A nobleman might change his linen undergarments multiple times a day. He'd wake up and put on a fresh shirt. After his morning ride, another fresh shirt. Before dinner, yet another. It was a constant cycle of peeling off a slightly soiled layer and replacing it with a pristine one. This wasn't about being clean, it was about having a clean buffer zone between your unwashed body and your extremely expensive velvet doublet. It was the ultimate status symbol. Only the truly rich could afford to have a wardrobe full of linen shirts and the servants to launder them. You weren't clean, but your linen was. It was a crucial and very visible distinction. Of course, this did very little about the inevitable byproduct of being an unwashed human, the smell. But here too, their perspective was a universe away from our own. Our modern obsession with smelling like absolutely nothing, or at best a vague synthetic ocean breeze, would have baffled them. They believed a certain natural musky human scent was a sign of vitality and vigor. The goal wasn't to eliminate this scent, but to manage it, to curate it. It was to be artfully blended with a cloud of heavy, expensive perfume, creating a personal olfactory cocktail that announced your presence long before you entered a room. The smell of a courtier at Versailles was a complex symphony of stale, sweat-powdered wig and a gallon of French perfume. Next up on our tour, the head. And if you think the body situation was questionable, buckle up. With washing being so infrequent, natural hair was, to put it mildly, a challenge. It was greasy, it was smelly, and it was a thriving metropolis for a tiny, unwelcome guest, the louse. Lice were an accepted democratic part of life, infesting everyone from the peasant to the prince. Picking lice out of each other's hair was a common social pastime. For men, the solution to this hairy, itchy problem was both simple and extreme: get rid of the hair. Shaving one's head became increasingly fashionable, but a bald nobleman isn't a good look, so they adopted the ultimate cover-up: the wig. The enormous, elaborate powdered peruke wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a masterclass in practical problem-solving. It concealed hair loss, often caused by syphilis. It allowed you to have a perfect hair day every day without any effort. And it conveniently moved your lice problem off-site. Think of it less as hair and more as a luxury detached condominium for your head pests. These wigs, often made from human or horse hair, were never washed with water. They were sent to a wig maker to be baked, combed, and restyled, and to keep them looking fresh and smelling less stale, they were covered in a thick layer of powder. This powder was usually a scented starch like wheat or rice flour, but it was often mixed with other, more alarming ingredients. White lead could be added for a brighter white, a substance we now know is a neurotoxin. It was a system that was both brilliantly practical and subtly deadly. It was the 17th century equivalent of dealing with a fruit fly problem by fumigating your kitchen with asbestos. For women, the situation was even more precarious. They kept their natural hair, but styled it into enormous complex structures called poufs. These were towers of hair built over wire frames and pads, held together with pomade made from animal fat. These elaborate styles were not taken down for weeks, sometimes even months at a time. As you can imagine, the rancid fat, sweat, and powder created an irresistible environment for vermin. It was not uncommon for a noblewoman's magnificent hairdo to be secretly housing a family of mice. Let's continue our journey downward to the mouth, or as it was known for much of this period, the foul-smelling cavern of horrors. The single greatest disaster for aristocratic dental health was the arrival of sugar. It was a new, incredibly expensive, and highly addictive luxury, and the wealthy consumed it with abandon. The result was a dental apocalypse. The court of Queen Elizabeth I was a famous example. Her teeth were said to be blackened and rotten from her love of sweets, a condition that actually became a strange status symbol among the rich. A mouth full of rotting teeth was a sign you could afford sugar. A courtier's smile was less a sign of happiness and more a preview of an upcoming dental horror film. Basic dental hygiene was essentially non-existent. They had toothpicks and might rub their teeth with a rough cloth, sometimes dipped in a mixture of soot or crushed brick. But the toothbrush as we know it was centuries away. Halitosis, or bad breath, was so common, it was simply an accepted part of social interaction. They would chew on cloves, cardamom, or parsley to mask the smell, but nothing could stop the underlying decay. And when decay led to a toothache, your options were grim. There were no root canals, no antibiotics. There was only one real solution: extraction. And your dentist was not a trained professional. He was often the local barber surgeon, or even the blacksmith, who had the same delicate touch with your molar as he did with an iron ingot. The procedure was a public spectacle performed without anesthetic, often with a crowd gathering to watch. The only pain relief was a stiff drink and the hope that you might pass out. Finally, let's zoom out. The grime wasn't just personal, it was environmental. The magnificent clothes of the aristocracy, the silks, the velvets, the brocades, were almost never washed. Water was seen as ruinous to the expensive fabrics. Instead, clothes were spot cleaned, aired out, brushed, and perfumed relentlessly. A single court gown might be worn for years, passed down through generations, accumulating the scents and stains of its many owners. Even the palaces themselves were far from clean. While the grand halls might be swept for ceremonies, the private quarters were often dusty. The tapestries were heavy with grime, and the sanitation was a nightmare of chamber pots and poor drainage. This was a world that existed before the germ theory, a world that moved through a fine layer of filth, all of it shrouded in a thick fog of incense and perfume. It was a world where you had to perform your status every single day in the most brutal high school cafeteria you can imagine. And part of that performance was adhering to these bizarre standards of hygiene. To them, this wasn't disgusting. It was simply the way the world worked. It was the smell of civilization. So our slightly smelly tour of the aristocratic body is complete. We've seen the unwashed skin, the lice-infested wigs, and the dental nightmares. And the question that hangs in the perfume-stale air is, why? How could an entire class of people, the most educated and powerful in the world, get something so fundamentally wrong for so long? To answer that, we must step out of the narrative and into the chamber. This is where we conduct the historical autopsy, where we move beyond the what and dissect the why. It's easy to look back from our modern pedestal of antibacterial soap and twice daily brushing and simply call them stupid. But they weren't. They were trapped, not by a supernatural curse, but by a perfect storm of bad science, social pressure, and a profound, paralyzing fear. So let's recap the brilliant logic we've encountered. To avoid getting sick from bad air, you must avoid water. To combat body odor, you must apply enough perfume to knock out a horse. And to deal with hair pests, you must construct a powdered, potentially flammable luxury apartment on your head. It was a system that was internally consistent and externally absolutely insane. Let's open the case file. Exhibit A, the tyranny of a bad idea, the gospel of miasma. The prime suspect in our investigation is not a person, but an idea, the miasma theory. And we cannot overstate the power this single flawed idea held over the European mind for centuries. It wasn't just a scientific hypothesis. It became a kind of secular dogma, a new gospel of health that was accepted with the same fervor as religious scripture. In a world of fervent militant faith where religious purity was paramount, the quest for purity from bad air became a new, all-consuming obsession. The true power of miasma theory was that it seemed to explain everything. Why did plagues often start in the poorest, most crowded parts of the city? Because those were the smelliest, most miasma-producing areas. Why did people get sick near swamps and marshes miasma? Why did a battleground become a place of disease after the fighting was over? The miasma of rotting bodies. The theory was a perfect feedback loop of confirmation bias. Every time disease and bad smells appeared together, which they often do for reasons we now understand are related to bacteria, it was seen as absolute proof of the theory's correctness. They correctly identified a correlation, but got the causation spectacularly wrong. This belief system was so powerful that it actively blinded them to other possibilities. It was a form of institutional ignorance. The medical and scientific establishment clung to it, teaching it in universities and practicing it in clinics. To question miasma theory wasn't just to be a radical, it was to be a fool who was ignoring the obvious evidence all around them. In a way, the establishment's dogmatic belief in this theory was its own form of burying the truth. Not a malicious cover-up, but a refusal to see a different reality, a refusal born from the comfort of having a simple answer to a terrifyingly complex question. And the central unshakable tenet of this scientific faith was that water, especially hot water, was a traitor. It opened the gates of the body to the enemy. Exhibit B, the performance of status, hygiene as fashion. But bad science alone doesn't explain everything. Our second exhibit is about the engine that drove these habits into the very fabric of high society social pressure. Even if miasma theory had never existed, the royal courts of Europe were a theater of vanity and competition so intense that it would have likely produced bizarre habits anyway. The court was a place of constant performance. A noble's entire life was about projecting an image of wealth, power, and effortless superiority. As we've seen in other royal contexts, a high-born woman was often seen as a strategic instrument, and her value was tied to her presentation. This applied to everyone at court. Your appearance, your clothes, your jewels, your wig was your resume. And in this context, the logic of their hygiene makes a strange kind of sense. Why was changing your linen shirt more important than washing your body? Because the shirt was visible. People could see the pristine white lace at your collar and cuffs, a clear and public signal that you were wealthy enough to afford a mountain of laundry. No one could see your unwashed skin underneath. Why wear a towering powdered wig? Because it was the height of fashion, a symbol that you were in step with the trends set by the king himself. The fact that it was also a convenient place to hide your lice-infested unwashed hair was just a bonus. These habits became a uniform of the elite. To be clean in our modern sense, to smell of soap and water, might have been seen as strange, eccentric, or even bourgeois. It would have meant you smelled like a common person. The goal was not to be clean, but to appear refined. The aristocratic ideal was to present a perfectly composed, powdered and perfumed exterior, a masterpiece of artifice that floated serenely above the grime of the real world. In the most brutal high school cafeteria you can imagine, which was the royal court, you did not want to be the weird kid who smelled like soap. You conformed to the smelly, stylish norm, or you risked social oblivion. Exhibit C, the invisible enemy, a world without germs. Our final exhibit is perhaps the most important because it addresses the vast, empty space in their understanding of the world. They were fighting a war against an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't name, and couldn't even imagine. They had no concept of germs. Try for a moment to truly imagine that reality. A world where infection is a mystery, where disease is an act of God or a puff of bad air. A world where you have no idea that a microscopic universe of bacteria and viruses is teeming on your hands, in your water, and in your food. In this world, the idea of washing your hands to prevent sickness would sound like pure, unadulterated nonsense. Wash them for what? To remove a threat you cannot see, taste, or smell. It would be like telling someone today to wear a tinfoil hat to block psychic alien signals. It's a solution to a problem that in their reality does not exist. Without the germ theory, there is no logical reason to connect filth with disease. A dirty floor is a cosmetic problem, not a health hazard. A surgeon's unwashed hands are irrelevant as long as his knives are sharp. And a body that hasn't been bathed is perfectly fine as long as it's covered in clean linen and enough perfume. This lack of knowledge is what allowed all the other factors, the fear of miasma, the social pressures, to fester and grow. They were operating in the dark with a fundamentally flawed map of reality. Just as the story of Juana la Loca shows how a personality could be pathologized and her strengths reframed as symptoms of madness, this entire era pathologized the very act of bathing. They took a healthy, natural practice and reframed it as a dangerous, reckless symptom of a person who didn't care about their own health. The clean were seen as the crazy ones. So what was the true nature of this cursed chamber? It was a prison of the mind. A chamber built from the sturdy bricks of a flawed scientific theory, cemented together with the mortar of social anxiety, and decorated with the lavish tapestries of fear and superstition. The curse wasn't a demon that made people afraid of water. The curse was ignorance itself. The nobles of the Age of Grime were trapped in an invisible cage of their own making. They peered out at the world through the bars of their flawed understanding, seeing phantoms in the air and danger in a bar of soap. They spent centuries fighting the wrong enemy, developing elaborate and absurd defenses against a threat that wasn't real, all while being silently and invisibly attacked by the true culprit they couldn't comprehend. They were living in a world haunted by the ghost of miasma, while being systematically conquered by an invisible army of microbes. And that is a horror story more profound than any tale of ghosts or ghouls. And so our tour of the Age of Grime comes to a close. We have peered into the chamber of their ignorance and seen the bizarre logic that turned an entire continent against the simple act of bathing. We are left with the lingering scent of historical absurdity. But what happened next? How did Europe finally rediscover the miracle of soap and water? And what is the final enduring lesson from this strange, unwashed chapter of our past? This is The Echo. The final verdict on the Age of Grime is as clear as it is pungent. It was a centuries-long cultural pathology, a societal neurosis, born from a deep foundational fear. It was a massive social experiment in what happens when a civilization decides to treat its own skin like an enemy combatant. The results, as we've seen, were not great. This wasn't just a quirky historical phase, filled with smelly people and fabulous wigs. It was a period of profound discomfort and danger. It was a world where a person could simply disappear, not just into a dark alley, but into an early grave, from diseases that were silently aided and abetted by the very hygiene practices designed to prevent them. The tragedy here was not political, but biological. A civilization-wide failure to understand the most basic principles of health. Now, the end of this era didn't happen overnight. There was no single day when everyone in Europe woke up and decided to finally take a shower. The ripple effect was a slow, gradual thaw after a long, grimy winter. Through the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment brought a new emphasis on reason and science, and slowly the dogmatic belief in miasma began to crack. Philosophers and doctors began to tentatively suggest that perhaps fresh air and clean water weren't, in fact, deadly assassins. The real turning point came in the 19th century with the rise of new ideas about health. Suddenly, water was rebranded. The very thing that was once seen as a killer was now marketed as a cure. The hydropathy movement saw the wealthy flocking to spa towns to take the water cure, drinking and bathing in mineral springs to treat all sorts of ailments. The bath was slowly being rehabilitated, transforming from a death trap into a luxury health treatment. But the true silver bullet, the scientific discovery that would finally kill the miasma monster, once and for all, came from the laboratory. This is where the heroes of our story finally enter the scene. In France, a chemist named Louis Pasteur conducted a series of brilliant experiments that proved that decay and disease were not caused by bad air, but by tiny, invisible living organisms. He called them germs. It was a revolution. The enemy, for the first time, had a face, albeit a microscopic one. Across the channel in Britain, a surgeon named Joseph Lister read Pasteur's work and had a eureka moment. He realized that the horrific rates of death from infection after surgery were not just bad luck. They were caused by these germs entering the wounds. He pioneered the use of carbolic acid as an antiseptic, cleaning his instruments and the wounds themselves. The results were miraculous. Survival rates skyrocketed. The germ theory was no longer a theory, it was a life-saving fact. The final climactic battle against the Age of Grime was not fought in a laboratory, but in the heart of the British Empire. In the summer of 1858, the city of London, whose river had become little more than an open sewer, experienced an event that would be immortalized as the Great Stink. A heat wave baked the city's untreated sewage, which festered in the Thames, releasing a miasma so powerful, so profoundly disgusting, that it brought the nation to its knees. The smell was so bad, it literally shut down Parliament. The politicians who for decades had ignored the problem were now forced to flee their own chamber handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. It was the ultimate act of karmic justice. The filth they had been content to let the poor live in had finally come for them. This was the last gasp of the old world. Faced with a stench that threatened to suffocate the government, Parliament acted with a speed born of pure desperation. Within weeks, they passed a bill to fund the creation of one of the greatest engineering marvels of the 19th century, Joseph Bazalgette's London sewer system. It was a colossal network of tunnels that intercepted the city's waste and carried it far away from the river. It saved London from cholera and laid the foundation for the modern sanitary city. The Age of Grime was finally, officially being flushed away. So what is the final human insight we can take away from all this? What is the meaning of this long, strange, and unwashed journey? It is above all a profound lesson in intellectual humility. It's easy for us to laugh at them, to mock their fear of water and their powdered wigs. But they were acting on the best science available to them. They were doing what they thought was right to protect themselves and their families. Their story is a powerful reminder that what we consider basic common sense today was once considered dangerous lunacy. It makes you wonder what obvious things are we doing right now that future generations will make snarky history videos about. It's also a story about the immense power of fear. The fear of the plague was so deep and so enduring that it reshaped the most basic habits of an entire civilization for 300 years. It shows how a collective trauma can lead to deeply irrational but internally logical behaviors that become embedded as tradition. In the end, the Age of Grime is a reminder that history is not a clean, linear march of progress. It is a messy, smelly, and often backward shuffling journey. It teaches us that the line between a life-saving scientific truth and a deadly old wives' tale is sometimes only visible in hindsight. And it should make us profoundly grateful for the simple, boring, and utterly miraculous trio of soap water and the knowledge of what to do with them. It was a long and dirty fight to win that knowledge. The least we can do is wash our hands